Clearly, we're going to be taking a look at King's Speech, I Have a Dream. So I would open up to the page 625, I believe, because we'll be looking at certain paragraphs and finding examples of various devices and all that kind of stuff. So you have it in front of you, ready to go. If you don't have it with you, save your trip from the locker behind Carol. There are a couple extras. Just make sure you drop it off there before you go at the end of the day. We're in the period at the end of the day. Except for you. Maybe you're in the day. Wait today.
No, I'm ready.
Pretty well. Argument. Haley gets the switch seats for there. Big shit for her. Like the story. The water.
You can read my essay. You'll know my essay.
Not an essay. Response. An essay. Wednesday, the only real assignment that you're focused on now is going to be your rough draft for Wednesday. And at some point, if you have it, you need to break the ice and just start. Keep in mind, you're typing it up. At some point, you might just want to do a thesis statement, come up with a SPA, and we're going to kind of do like a practice as if we had to write an annual essay about I Have a Dream. We'll go through those steps, that process, just like we do for creative draft. But if you can't come up with an attention grabber or all the background details that you want to start with your intro, you don't have to. If you know what that SPA, those devices, the argument would be, just kind of start with that and see where it goes. It unfolds. Keep in mind, your rough draft, it's not going to be graded overall and necessarily quality at this point. I know there's going to be some things you want to add and change and rearrange and whatnot. Wednesday, I'm really just worried about you getting another essay under your belt before we start worrying about final topics later on. We don't do rough drafts for all essays. It's actually pretty rare that we do rough drafts. We'll do a couple others, but for the most part, the whole purpose behind this rough draft is just to kind of get you in the swing of things again. So, but I would start up. If over the weekend you run into some issues, keep in mind you can go online, check out videos again for SPA, soapstone. If that's going to help you recharge some things, send me an email. If you're having a little bit of an SOS issue, I can try to help you out with that. Anybody have any questions about Grapes of Wrath? Because I don't think we're really going to talk about it today with anything, but any concepts from it, need to just double check requirements. The easiest way, not easiest, but the way in which people sometimes lose a couple points for the rough draft is forgetting the works cited page. I think maybe because it's a rough draft. It might be a good idea for you just to kind of set up like a template file for AP English where you always have your heading, your header, and you already have like a works cited page ready to go, so you can copy and paste in whatever you're going to be using or type it in, just so you don't kind of forget those kinds of things. So it might be something to do over the weekend if you haven't already. All right, so as I said, for the plan here with King is we're going to take a look at his speech. I want to do a soapstone first, so we'll go over the whole speaker, occasion, audience, purpose, subject, tone, and then take a look at, all right, what are specific things that you see within it so far as rhetorical devices? And then if you were going to do something analytically about it, which ones do you think you would pick so far as strategies, purpose, argument? Again, just to kind of go through all of those steps that you're going to be doing with the Grapes of Wrath and any other texts that we have coming up. What's the easy answer for speaker that we don't want to use? Martin Luther King Jr. And again, just simply don't want to use it because the name in itself doesn't really mean anything. Now, that's not necessarily the case for his name with you because you do associate certain things with Martin Luther King Jr. So what are those things that you associate? And we can start to put that information as speaker. So adjectives, descriptions, what comes to mind? Martin Luther King Jr. Jack, what's something? Okay. Nicole and then Aiden will go to you next. Activist.
I was going to say civil rights.
Okay. Person. inequality. Just for the sake of space, I'm going to write pacifist, but same thing. Not believing in violence. Some people think of sit-ins and those kinds of demonstrations, certainly along with them, that would fall along with that. Anything else? His name, Martin Luther King Jr., generally we add labels at the front of his name based on profession or achievements that he's made. Like what would be his title on business card letterhead? Doctor would be one, and so certainly with doctor, intelligence degrees, well educated, and there'd also be one other one. Not Mr. Starts off with the. And it goes with an R. This title is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So he is a minister, and certainly, as we said, very well educated. Is that a big deal? Minister? For a lot of, not regardless of, any religious feelings, denominations, or whatnot, but certainly if a person is understood to be, minister, the idea of having holiness behind them, it helps with your ethos or overall credibility, bring those terms in, where it carries a little bit more weight. So that certainly would be significant. Doesn't start off his speech, I am the Reverend Doctor, but people know who he is when he's about to go. Anything else there for speaker? The hope is now that you see, okay, we have an African-American minister who's well-educated, a civil rights activist who believes in equality but wants to do it through a pacifist or nonviolent approach. That means more now than when you're looking at the content of the speech and just simply going, oh, this is by Martin Luther King Jr. Occasion, where are we? When are we? What are some details we can throw in? The nice thing is we get a little intro blurb that kind of gives us some of those occasion details that we can have.
Washington, D.C. in August of 1960.
Okay, we're off by 2 days. 8/28/1963 in D.C. And specifically, where in D.C., Michelle? Lincoln Memorial. Olivia, did you have another thing?
Yeah, I was going to say it's the centennial anniversary of the
Okay, so that 1963 is a big deal, and we certainly see that coming up within the course of the speech when you see 100 years later, or you would hear it or read it over and over again, making reference to that Emancipation Proclamation. Also, that makes it a big deal that makes sense to be in front of Lincoln's memorial statue if you are in reference, homage to that centennial anniversary. Now, these are things that absolutely are true, make sense, actual location and whatnot. Within the nation, like what would kind of be like an era that we would associate with 1960s? So the civil rights movement itself is going on. That might be something to kind of call attention to and certainly makes sense since he's an activist for that movement. So if it is the civil rights movement, you don't have a movement unless there's some turmoil going on, so there certainly are some racial inequality issues that are being dealt with that they're going to try to address. I'm going to skip audience, go down to purpose. What would be some one-word verbs that you think you might use as to what's the whole overall purpose of the speech? You don't have to think about, will I use this for a thesis statement with a SPA statement, but if we come up with some nice purposes, we could end up, using them over there later on. Just go on down the line, Rose. Okay. Now we need to make it a verb, which we can do. Inspire. Kelsey, did she take your answer? Feel free to give her an elbow. Any others you want to use, or? Pardon? Okay, that's fine. Reform. Preach. That kind of makes sense since we Have a minister. Motivate. Eva do. Advocate. Nothing wrong with any of those. Okay, now, so who's he trying to inspire, preach to, advocate, reform, motivate? Who is that target group? Again, not AP junior high school students at North Hills. Who's the audience? I mean, you do have a literal audience, because it is a speech. Who's he talking to? It's always funny, the questions that people get stuck. Okay, there is a march on Washington. And this is part of the march. So you have certainly black citizens as well as, it makes reference, oh, there's other people here too. You have black and white. Have you ever seen or heard the speech, or at least parts of the speech? How come? How were you able to do that?
It's very famous, and we also read like part of the ending.
Okay. But how were you able to see it or hear it?
Because I can read. She's not wrong.
She didn't hear it or see it, she read it.
There's a video of it, and everybody said.
Okay, so it's recorded. This is, I mean, and there are microphones in front of them. It's not like someone took out a cell phone and then just started doing that, but it is in some ways a national audience in that it is recorded. So it is certainly going to these people, but there's also a national audience, some of which would be, those who are there, March on Washington, are probably in what of his ideas? Probably in favor, support, they're along with him. A lot of the folks that he would also be talking to are probably not in favor of the idea. So this national audience, it could both be those in support as well as those within opposition. And I don't, Abby, did you say reform? For real reform to take place, who has to really get that mechanism moving, in motion? If you are going to end, I mean, you have desegregation occurring, but maybe not at the pace that we want. You have to have the government involved, and certainly there is some opposition within the government, but it's not only just the regular average citizens probably would think there is some government. Some of those who were most steadfastly against, desegregation, you have political offices, in a lot of states. Certainly, we focus on those in the South where would be opposed to such things. This one, the subject, is probably going to seem pretty redundant at this point, but what is the overall subject matter, the content that he is trying to address? Civil rights. Civil rights and equality probably end up being the two most common responses. Certainly makes sense. Anything, I don't want to say unrelated to those, but anything a little bit different from those? Because what would be a concern if you might have people within a government who are opposed, and you are going back to 100 years before when Lincoln had to sign an Emancipation Proclamation. How do we really categorize Lincoln's presidency? I mean, what really is synonymous with him in it besides the end of slavery? Pardon? Violence because of you have assassination of him, civil war. I mean, the nation is fractured. What's going on in 1963? Civil rights movement.
It's similar because it's again, it's fractured.
Okay.
So they want the nation to come together.
And it's certainly not I don't want to say to the same degree, but it's in a different manner. You know, there are not cannons and gunshots and whatnot going on all the time, although there certainly are protests, police violence, things of that nature. So in some ways, that subject of having a split or a divided nation certainly is still a subject matter that he's bringing up.
Police brutality.
Sure. Later on in the year, and some of you have already looked at it, I think, we'll look at letter from Birmingham jail, where he's in Birmingham jail, you know, based on having to do protests against police brutality that would be taking place. Anything else subject-wise? How about tone? Passionate? Apparently I dotted my A. Carol? Uplifting? Jordan? Pleading? Good? Hopeful? That was gonna be it? I'd probably throw one more on there. Just because, and we don't normally really associate it with him, probably because he is nonviolent, pacifist. But he's also pretty what? He's pretty upset. I mean, there is a fair amount of anger, and rightfully there should be, based on things that are taking place. And I would say overall, it probably is more of an uplifting, pleading, I like, hopeful, passionate response. But he makes no mistake that early on he's pretty upset, and so I think that is important to take into context. Now again, I don't think a whole lot of this is anything brand new, but by doing that soapstone, it kind of puts you now into the frame of mind. It might remind you of some details that might have slipped by, like, hey, he is in D.C., Lincoln Memorial, 100 years after that signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and by no means going that we will definitely use these, but that whole idea of inspiring, preaching, advocating, motivating, those are giving us some possible purposes that we might use come thesis statement time once we get to the SPA. So the soapstone, I don't want to say it's going to unlock everything, but I think it puts you in that right frame of mind to not only focus on the text itself, but also some external factors that could be helpful.
So whereas the SPA thing is like specifically to make the thesis statement, is this just a brainstorming?
I think, yeah, this is more up to get you into that frame of mind. And of the three acronyms we've done this week, DIDDLE, SOAPSTONE, and SPA, and we don't do like 3 a week, and your mind will be fried. I think this is the one that people neglect the most. Or at least most frequently kind of forget about it. Probably for the fact because SPA and DIDDLES, there's that direct correlation to this leads to the paper. The physical argument, the thesis statement, the body paragraphs. This one doesn't have that direct connection. Maybe you could again argue here that purpose it does, but these I still think put you in that better frame of mind, give you a better perspective so that the DIDDLES and the SPA you come up with become much more effective overall. It might not seem as important when you're dealing with Martin Luther King Jr. because you are so familiar with him, but when we start looking at Heart of Darkness on Monday, again, Conrad doesn't really mean a whole lot. When we look at The Catcher in the Rye, I don't know if the name Salinger really means a whole lot, but as we know more about them, I think that makes this all the more important. So you kind of get an idea as to where he or she could be coming from. But you're right, those other two are much more direct, will lead to something a little bit more tangible, whereas this is kind of brainstorming for you. Okay? Now, the part that probably was not all that difficult. Before you come up with the thesis, you have to try to come up with, well, what are going to be some possible areas to take a look at, and we could spend probably half an hour on every single page. So what are some examples, in any particular order, we don't have, whatever you want. What do you notice so far as diction, imagery, details, figurative language, syntax while reading?
I'm not sure if it would be figurative language or syntax, but there's a lot of
Syntax is probably where it's going to go, more often than not. When you start dealing with repetition, and in speeches, you will probably notice more types of repetition, whether it be anaphora, anaphora. Epistrophe is the same thing, but it's at the end of sentences. Parallel structure, you will notice quite a lot. And you also take notice of alliteration. Because keep in mind, this text isn't being circulated to the audience, but you have to listen to it. So what's the effect of repeating now or 100 years later over and over and over again? In case Carol missed it the first time, I'm going to say it again and again and again. Dignity and discipline, the marvelous new militancy. You use that type of that alliteration, it calls attention to that phrase. And so with speeches, I think you will notice more and more of that. So if it's repetition, generally it's going to fall into syntax. Because he uses a lot of it. For the anaphora, any terms that,
I haven't.
yeah? I have a dream. I'm not going to list every single one of them. He does make reference with the now. Beginning of the speech, what's really the first one that he uses, kind of at the end of that first page, 625, going on to 626, so far as time, 100 years later. And you also at the end, besides I have a dream, let freedom ring gets repeated quite a bit. Okay, good. Since I mentioned it up here, now, what makes and now is on, I think, 626, maybe paragraph 4. What makes now jump out, on the page? Since Aiden told us she read it. Olivia? It's italicized, okay? There's a little bit of a trap that I don't want you to fall into. You wouldn't want to go, the syntax of King is very effective because he calls attention to the use of the word now by putting it in italics. You're right, but what's going to make me kind of go, right, it is spoken word. So you could certainly argue that he's putting it, and it does repeat, at the beginning. So you can still use now, and he's placing emphasis on it. But you want to be careful when it comes to things like, we talked about lack of quotation marks with, chapter 5 or chapter 7. It's different when you're dealing with a book than when you're dealing with a speech. I remember I felt bad for the person, but I won't say it butchered their essay, but it made the paragraph fairly effective. We were looking at a speech, they did a new class essay for it, and there was speech in the text, bracket, pause for applause, close bracket. They were calling attention as to how he put the applause at the right places within the speech. You can certainly anticipate that there might be some applause and whatnot, but that's not part of the text of the speech. So I'm glad that people do start to focus on those nuances and whatnot, but it doesn't necessarily work for something that is meant to be verbal, speech, as opposed to a text that's going to be written. And if it's a letter, sure, syntax can play a big part so far as punctuation and italics and things like that, underline. But if you're dealing with a speech, keep in mind, you'd be listening to it as opposed to reading it. So it doesn't mean that essay becomes, completely unsuccessful. But you probably did waste a good 10, 15 minutes on a paragraph that's not going to help you out any. And so in that part, that paragraph becomes unsuccessful. What else? Other techniques. Again, we're all over. Cole?
There's imagery that says now is the time to make real promises of democracy, now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the summit path of justice.
Okay. So there's and he does a fair amount of like light type imagery, light and dark, whether you're dealing with skin color or kind of overall mood. And you mentioned desolate. What was the other? I think it was like desolate depths or.
Oh yeah, desolate valley of segregation.
Okay. There was another, I think it was before desolate. I want to say there was another D word I heard. But you could certainly use that for the imagery. Someone might use that same example when it comes to the alliteration, trying to call attention to it. But certainly a lot of light, dark imagery. So we got that desolate valley. You'll get things like rolling waters. You know, makes a lot of reference to environmental. Or,
I think it's a pretty good language on page 68, because
Is it My Country 'Tis of Thee? Yep. And he does a fair amount of allusions, and you're right, we can put that in with figurative language, okay? So we have allusion, where it's My Country 'Tis of Thee. There's another song he makes reference to, you know, spiritual, Negro spiritual from years past. So music certainly is coming up quite a bit. Any other allusions? Because there's a lot.
He talks about the Constitution and Declaration of Independence.
Mhm.
He says the like.
Okay. And this certainly would be a big one. Declaration of Independence with that life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, especially if we go with the idea that what's one of his target audiences? The government. What are the rules that the government lives by? Constitution, Declaration of Independence. So by calling those things out, it certainly is going to tap into that audience. And also, how does he start the speech?
High schools.
What's he mean by 5 score? A score's 20 years, so by him going 5 score, he's saying 100 years ago, but you know score 4 score 7 years ago, which is Gettysburg Address, Abraham Lincoln, whose symbolic shadow we stand. Oh, that's right, he's right there. So you have a little bit of a mimicking allusion as well as calling him out as mentioning the great emancipator, you know, right then and there as well. So absolutely, that's a pretty strong allusion that's going to be getting made.
There's an allusion to the Bible on 6:27, and it says, "Let us not wallow in the valley of despair."
Kind of makes sense that he would make a biblical allusion. Minister, one of the purposes, you know, preaching, so certainly he is going to call out. Now, keep in mind, now you're also hitting a lot of target audiences, Declaration of Independence, songs from the past, you know, spirituals, My Country 'Tis of Thee, kindergartners are saying at the beginning of every day, probably then. You have biblical references. You ask anybody in 1963 and probably 2016, give me top 5 presidents, the majority of folks are going to include Abraham Lincoln. So he's really now kind of hitting all of those target audiences that he would be trying to. And figurative language, I mean, we could keep going and going. There's tons of them. Extended metaphor, I think he does a really nice one on 626. What kind of concept does he keep coming back to over and over again?
The bad check.
Yeah, the whole, like the Bank of Justice and all those things. The bad check, we've defaulted on this promissory note. So far as the citizens of color are concerned, instead of honoring the sacred obligation, they have given the Negro people a bad check which will come back marked insufficient funds. Certainly, this would go down as being an extended metaphor. It is a metaphor, but it's extended in the sense that he keeps coming back to it multiple times within the context of that paragraph. And there's certainly other metaphors that are rolling throughout the course of this. He has personification at the top of that page, crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. Those would be more one-time kind of metaphors or personification taking place. So absolutely figurative language throughout. And, in between those in paragraph 5, direct reference to Constitution, direct Declaration of Independence. You don't have to quote something or allude to it in the sense of, an indirect reference to being allusion. By him saying Declaration of Independence, Constitution, he's making a pretty direct link, reference, allusion to those things. So don't feel as if you have to find, a quote in order for it to say it's allusion, like the 5 score. By him using those terms, it's still allusion. word choice tends to be popular, diction, when people are doing rhetorical analysis early on. Any specific words you found to be have a little more power, meaning maybe behind them?
On 6.6, you like describe things like manacles and chains and acceleration.
A large portion of the population are trapped. You know, they lack. What are you trying to look for with civil rights movement? Equality and what's that F word? Freedom. Manacles, chains keep that freedom from happening. So that makes sense.
At the bottom, 627, he says, the state of Mississippi, a desert state sweltering with the heat of injustice and oppression.
Mhm.
Like, I don't know, that's a pretty fiery sentence.
And that pretty good. This is better than when you tried to read the sentence the other day. I could see, and this would be with a lot of there's multiple areas. I think you could certainly make the argument for imagery, just because you're right. There's sensory that goes along with it. Some of the words simply just like sweltering or injustice, oppression, transform into a what of freedom? Oasis. So maybe that oasis could go with diction. Could certainly go with metaphor because it's not going to be a literal, oasis. The nice thing about there, you have Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina get mentioned. But what does he also start doing on the other page as well? Because you expect this to be, the viewpoint is whose problem is segregation and inequality? A lot of folks are going to go the South, those states. But what else does he mention? Lydia? New Hampshire's thrown. I mean, the whole nation, this is something that has to be understood, which makes sense that you're going to give the speech, therefore, in the capital of the nation. He's not giving this speech in Birmingham. He's not in Charleston. He's not in Atlanta. He's in the nation's capital. This is the nation's issue. This is the nation needs to respond to it. Now, this is a little bit different from what you were mentioning, but the fact that he also, you could argue, allusion to the whole entire country, trying to be inclusive of them, which again makes sense because if you're lacking freedom, if we are divided, what must happen? We got to bring them back together. I think on that same page that you were at, guys, on 627, I think at the top of the page, in paragraph number 6, he uses a really nice term which would try to bring an end to that division. And it's not a word that you looking at just, individually would go, wow, that's a good word. But in the context of the way he uses it, I think it gives a little bit more power to it. Paragraph 6. Anyone want to take a guess? It's brothers. Going back a little bit. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force, nonviolent, pacifist. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people, for many of our white brothers, as evidenced by the presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is with our destiny, and their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. He could have used people, he could have used citizens, he could have used friends, and I don't think anybody would have a single problem with the speech. They wouldn't go, you know what, you really dropped the ball in that 6th paragraph, you should have switched that word to brothers. It would have been fine. But what does brothers do? As opposed to friends, citizens, people, supporters, whatever the case may be.
It promotes coming together, these types of emotions.
Yeah, if we look at the overall subject that we had listed down here, where we're trying to inspire people, reform, motivate them, we have a split nation, bring it back together. Certainly, manacles and chains absolutely reinforce how this split has occurred, this oppression that's taking place, but there is hope for brothers, family. And certainly putting white in front of it is a very, very big deal because a lot of people at the time, this is an African American, black, Negro problem. This isn't a national problem. No, we have support, and we are certainly going to welcome that support by everyone who's here.
With brothers, it's like they're both coming from the same place. Like in the end, like we all derive
the same thing.
Right. So this is something that's not. You're not trying to make that square peg fit in the round hole, but it is natural. It's biology. Same species and all those types of things. What would be a good word? I think if we went with the manacles and chains, which is still excellent terms, what would be a good adjective for manacles and chains with diction? Like what type of diction? If you were going to call attention to those terms. Oppressive would certainly work. Entrapment or entrapping diction, all those things. I think oppressive would be good. What would be good for something like brothers? As to a type of diction. Okay, so like an obligating diction, all come together. Unifying, I mean, we say come together. And with brothers, what pronouns does he tend to use quite a bit throughout the course of the speech? There's a lot of we, there's a lot of our. When you're divided, what pronouns get used quite a bit? Us, them, but he's doing the we and the our. So it's something as simple as we, our, brothers, independently, you look at them as words, they don't really have lights flashing around them and fireworks, but when you look at what he is trying to accomplish, those now become very, very important. So by coming up now with a list of possible rhetorical devices, I know we didn't come up with details, but for sake of time, so we have these things. What would we like? Emily, pick one that you would like to use. Can't go wrong. Illusion, that sounds good. What else? Jack, pick one.
Repetition.
Okay. Kaylee, pick one. Imagery? Okay. So we have all those things. So now we have our devices. So imagery, illusion, and repetition. What could be some purposes to make our sentence? Inspire, motivate a country to come together. Unifying diction, allusion, and extended metaphor, preach that it's time for the split to end within the United States of America or whatnot. But you just go with your three devices, you come up with a purpose, you could certainly add to these, and then that overall argument as to what's going on. So that's kind of like how the three work in harmony. Do the soapstone to get you in the frame of mind, do the diddles to start to locate the examples, and then the SPA puts that sentence together so you have a clear focus that you would write throughout. The one thing you have to make sure is that the three devices, strategies that you pick can all work in harmony for that one argument. The manacles and the chains might not work as well with the coming together, depending on an argument that you're working with. Or, you can certainly argue that it starts with this is what's happened, but now we need to bring in these positive ideas to unite and bring a country together. You just want to make sure all those devices you use go together in some fashion. All right. Quizzes that I pass back are yours to keep. I don't need you back. Bedford Reader, you don't have to bring in for a while.